For decades, Kenya's northern corridor was the dominant gateway into much of East Africa's landlocked interior. The port of Mombasa served as the primary marine entrance to the region. Billions of dollars in refined petroleum, heavy machinery, and dry cargo moved inland through Kenya to reach Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, and the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Kenya held structural leverage over the regional supply chain. For landlocked economies, transit logistics through Mombasa represented an unavoidable cost of doing business. Then came the discoveries in the Albertine Graben. Deep beneath western Uganda lie an estimated 6.5 billion barrels of discovered oil, with roughly 1.4 billion designated as commercially recoverable. Uganda was no longer merely a consumer of fuel. It was preparing to become a major crude exporter. To bring that oil to global markets, Uganda needed a cross-border export pipeline, a 1,400-kilometer conduit reaching the Indian Ocean. For years, regional planners assumed the route would cross northern Kenya, connecting to Nairobi's proposed infrastructure corridor ending at Lamu Port. However, behind closed doors, a strategic shift was taking shape. A complex combination of routing economics, terrain profiles, land acquisition frameworks, and port infrastructure led Uganda and its international partners to evaluate an alternative path. Tanzania presented a competing proposal: access to an export terminal near Tanga, favorable transit terms, and a flat terrain profile along the central corridor. When the final agreements were concluded, Uganda chose the southern route. Ugandan crude would flow through Tanzania via the multi-billion-dollar East African crude oil pipeline. The decision challenged Kenya's assumed position as Uganda's dominant oil transit gateway, opening a new competition for regional energy influence. Understanding Uganda's routing decision requires looking at the technical composition of the crude itself. Oil from the Albertine Graben is heavy, highly viscous, and rich in paraffin wax. At lower temperatures, its high wax content can make the crude extremely viscous. To keep it flowing over hundreds of kilometers, the oil must be kept warm continuously along its entire journey to the coast. This makes the East African Crude Oil Pipeline, or EACOP, one of the most complex infrastructure projects ever built in the region. Spanning 1,443 kilometers, it is engineered to be the longest electrically heat-traced pipeline on Earth. When engineering teams evaluated the options, the northern route through Kenya presented notable structural hurdles. The path through northern Kenya involved navigating complex topography, volatile security zones, and multi-tiered land tenure systems. In Kenya, private and community land acquisition often involves lengthy legal negotiations, creating potential delays and cost overruns. Tanzania offered a different balance: a flatter geographical gradient, lower population density along the central path, and a state-managed land framework promising predictable right-of-way access. Additionally, the maritime approach near Tanga provided a suitable offshore environment for an artificial marine loading system, allowing supertankers to take on crude off the coast. When Uganda, Tanzania, and TotalEnergies finalized the deal, the spatial landscape of East African infrastructure changed permanently. The decision forced Nairobi to rethink how Lamu would attract the cargo volumes needed to justify its wider regional corridor. The pipeline route was locked in, setting off a broader competition across the downstream energy market. Uganda had lost the pipeline battle. It was not about to lose the fuel battle, too. While Uganda prepares for future crude exports, its immediate economy remains reliant on importing refined petroleum, diesel, petrol, and aviation fuel. Historically, Uganda imported over 90% of its refined fuel through the port of Mombasa, relying on Kenyan marketing companies to transport the fuel inland. In 2023, Kenya altered its import framework. Facing foreign exchange pressure and currency depreciation, Nairobi introduced a government-to-government fuel procurement system with state-backed energy companies in the Gulf, allowing nominated importers to purchase fuel on extended credit. While intended to stabilize domestic currency demand in Kenya, the framework created friction with neighboring importers. Ugandan officials argued that relying on Kenyan intermediaries exposed their domestic market to added administrative margins and currency conversion costs. Fuel prices in Kampala rose, triggering inflation concerns. In response, Uganda amended its petroleum laws to grant the state-owned Uganda National Oil Company, UNOC, exclusive rights to import all refined petroleum products into the country. UNOC signed a long-term supply agreement with global trader Vital to buy fuel directly on the open market. But to execute the strategy, UNOC needed a license to operate as an oil marketing entity within Kenya, gaining direct access to the state-owned Kenya pipeline infrastructure from Mombasa. The regulatory process stalled. Kenyan regulators raised legal objections regarding local incorporation. The resulting impasse led Uganda to file a suit at the East African Court of Justice while exploring alternative supply routes through Tanzania's port of Dar es Salaam. Recognizing that a permanent diversion of Ugandan fuel volumes would undermine throughput revenues for the Kenya Pipeline Company, regulatory discussions accelerated. By mid-2024, Nairobi and Kampala reached a regulatory compromise, granting UNOC operating status and restoring direct fuel transit through Mombasa. The dispute illustrated a new reality. Landlocked states were actively seeking greater autonomy over their critical energy supply lines. As traditional fuel transport routes face new competition, Kenya is emphasizing a domain where it holds a clear regional advantage: firm renewable power generation. While neighboring states focused heavily on hydrocarbon export lines and major river developments, Kenya built one of the most diversified clean energy grids in Africa. At the core of this network is the Olkaria geothermal complex in the Great Rift Valley. By tapping underground volcanic steam, Kenya has built more than 900 megawatts of installed geothermal capacity. Unlike solar or hydro, geothermal energy provides continuous, weather-independent baseload power year-round. Renewables account for the overwhelming majority of Kenya's electricity generation, with geothermal providing a major share alongside hydro, wind, and solar. This generation profile gives Nairobi a strategic role within the Eastern Africa power pool. Hydroelectric power, a major component of generation in Uganda and Tanzania, remains vulnerable to severe rainfall fluctuations and droughts. When water levels drop, hydroelectric generation can fall short of peak demand. Kenya's geothermal capacity gives it one of the region's strongest sources of weather-independent electricity, and a potential advantage as cross-border power trading expands. Concurrently, Kenya is leveraging its green power grid to attract industrial investment, positioning itself as a destination for energy-intensive manufacturing seeking low-carbon energy profiles. The regional energy picture is thus becoming bifurcated. While Uganda and Tanzania develop hydrocarbon assets, Kenya is anchoring its strategy on a high renewables power grid. Tanzania, meanwhile, is advancing a massive expansion of its domestic generation capacity. Along the Rufiji River, Tanzania completed construction on the Julius Nyerere hydropower project. With an installed capacity of 2,115 megawatts, the project represents one of the largest single additions to power generation capacity in East African history. For years, industrial growth in Tanzania was constrained by power supply limitations and high operating tariffs. The Nyerere project was conceived to transform the national energy balance. Dodoma aims to use this expanded capacity to achieve three principal objectives. First, to lower power tariffs for domestic industrial consumers, enhancing the competitiveness of local manufacturing. Second, to strengthen the electricity base needed to support Tanzania's expanding industrial and transport infrastructure, including its standard gauge railway. Third, to position Tanzania to explore potential power export opportunities within the Eastern Africa power pool as regional transmission interconnections mature. However, large-scale hydroelectricity involves operational considerations. Relying heavily on a single river basin exposes a significant portion of national generation to multi-year climate variability. During extended dry periods, managing reservoir levels becomes critical. Additionally, fully utilizing 2,000 megawatts requires substantial investment in high-voltage transmission lines and distribution substations to prevent localized grid overloads. The interaction between Kenya's geothermal baseload and Tanzania's expanded hydro capacity will determine regional electricity pricing and grid stability for decades to come. The energy landscape of East Africa has moved past the era of a single dominant corridor. The historic reliance on a single logistics route through Mombasa has evolved into a multi-hub system where infrastructure options are distributed across several national corridors. Uganda has established greater supply chain security by backing the EACOP pipeline through Tanzania and securing direct import mechanisms for its refined fuel. Tanzania has strengthened its role as a regional logistics and energy gateway, using Tanga and Dar es Salaam alongside its major hydropower and gas assets to serve the central continent. Kenya continues to build on its strengths as a regional financial, digital, and green energy hub, maintaining high-value logistics and firm power generation assets. This competition is driving accelerated infrastructure investment across the East African community. Ports are being expanded, cross-border transmission lines are being synchronized, and rail corridors are reaching deeper into the interior. Rather than fragmenting the region, infrastructure competition is giving landlocked nations, including Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and the DRC, multiple trade routes and competitive freight structures. No single country controls East Africa's energy future anymore. Kenya controls critical power and logistics. Tanzania controls an increasingly important southern corridor. Uganda controls something neither can manufacture, the region's emerging oil supply. And that is why the energy war is only beginning.